This slab and this crate were actually so large they couldn't be delivered to my little shop, so I had to have the shipment redirected to my wife's work, and even though she was inside working in her office, I still felt like she was watching and judging me attempt to break this giant crate apart. The reason I'm having this unusual crate delivered to this unusual location is recently I was having a conversation with one of the owners of one of the largest wood slab suppliers in the country, and this might surprise some of you out there, but generally I pay for all the wood that you see in my videos. I've gotten a few things for free in the past, but generally I want to work with the wood that I want to work with. I don't want to make a mediocre project just because the project is free or just because the wood slab is free. However, when I was talking to Dan over at GL Veneer, he said, "We want to give you any slab you want in our entire inventory." And I said, "Are there any limitations?" And he said, "No." And that is where I basically stopped listening to anything else he had to say and got on their website. The reason I was so excited about this blank check from GL is they have a much broader selection of wood than I normally have access to. They have things like Lebanese cedar and these massive cottonwood slabs, Buckeye burl, which apparently is not just a terrible mascot for an annoying fan base, it's also a really cool wood. But in the end, I ended up going with this Old Growth Redwood, which is actually the same wood that's up on my wall, but I have a much different project in mind for this one. I say that I had a different project in mind when I'd first ordered this slab, and that's true. However, the project that I'm starting on here is actually completely different. Initially, I was planning on making 2 dining tables. It'd probably be 7 to 8 feet long. They were going to be epoxy tables, but a different epoxy table than I'd done before. When we got the slab into the shop and we started playing around with layouts, Scott got almost sad. He thought it would basically be a sin to make 2 smaller tables out of this massive slab. So this is what Scott talked me into, a gigantic freaking round table. This is about 72 inches in diameter, almost 2 meters. And the reason I wanted to make dining tables though, is I like to make furniture and sell it. I'm a furniture shop. And almost anybody can take a 7 to 8 foot dining table. Almost nobody can fit a 6 foot round table, so I do not think this will sell. But I figured since I got this slab for free, we can just make this Scott's passion project and maybe someday it'll sell. Recently, I had a potential customer reach out about doing a table this exact same size, but out of walnut. He wanted it to be 72 inches walnut with black epoxy, and I actually really wanted to take this project on, which most of the time isn't the case when I get these custom furniture submissions. Most of the time people want me to make something they've seen me make before, a small coffee table or a desk or something like that, and I generally try to focus on the bigger projects, things that I haven't done before, like this giant redwood epoxy table I'm building here, and I've never built a round table this big or one as big as he wanted there. So I gave a pretty competitive quote. It was expensive, but it wasn't as expensive as if I'd already made 10 videos on doing a table like that. So I quoted him $25,000, which I know is a ton of money, but the guy got a little bit of sticker shock. He was fairly surprised because he's seen my prices before. He went on my website, he's seen my videos, and I think he got the impression that a 6 foot round table wasn't much different than a 6 foot desk, for instance. If it's 6 feet by 3 feet, he thought it wouldn't be much more just to add 3 feet to one side. But there's a ton of variables that go into why these round tables are so much more expensive. This here's a good example of one of the reasons of why a wide table is so much more difficult, hence expensive, than a narrow table. Normally, when I need to surface a piece of wood, I just go up to the industrial shop in Portland, run it through their wide belt sander, which can go up to 48 inches wide. Takes me about 15 minutes and costs me $80, and then I have a perfectly sanded piece of wood. This here is the only CNC or flattening machine that I know of really in the state of Oregon. There's probably one somewhere, but this is the only one that I know of. This is my friend Nick over at Maverick Sawmill. And like I said, there's not many of these places around, and this is like a half-day endeavor. This takes me all day, pack the thing up, and then have him go really, really slow on it. However, this is only in the, hundreds of dollars difference. This doesn't totally account for why it would be double or triple the expense of doing something smaller. By far the biggest expense when going with a really wide table is you need a really wide slab of wood, which means you need a really big tree. And to get a slab that would look good in a 6 foot even epoxy table, you need a tree that's 6 feet to maybe 8 feet wide. And guess what? They don't only grow 8 feet tall. So that slab could be giant. It's going to be a 10, 15, maybe 20 foot long slab. So you're going to have a lot of waste. Also, most sawmills won't even mill that wide. They'll turn it into multiple slabs that are smaller. And so getting a really big wide slab is 1, hard to find, and 2, really freaking expensive. If I were to have paid for this slab, it would have cost over $7,000 for reference. As with most any type of construction or woodworking, or specifically epoxy table making, the best practices is always evolving and getting a little bit better. It's kind of like sports, where if you look at the 70s football teams, and this is American football, I'm sorry for any of the European viewers out there, I don't know enough about soccer to give you a good comparison. But if you take the American football team, like the 72 Dolphins, they were incredible, the best team ever. If you put them in today's NFL, coached the same way, they'd probably be middle of the road or worse. And it's not a slight at them, that's just how good and how specialized everything's getting today. And epoxy tables are no different. I look at my first epoxy tables like the 70s Steelers. They got the job done, they won some championships, they did all right, but you don't see a lot of Terry Bradshaw highlight reels out there today because they just weren't that dynamic and that exciting. And that's how epoxy table making is. My first ones were poured one layer at a time, 1/8 of an inch, but we've got better epoxy now, we've got better technology, and that's why when I made my epoxy table workshop, I knew that it would be an ever-evolving course and just always getting better and improving. And that is why I'm frequently going back and I'm updating old chapters or adding new chapters to my epoxy workshop, because I want every single person that's ever signed up for it, whether it's 3 years ago or 3 hours ago, to have the very best up-to-date information and the best practice that applies today, not best practice from 3 years ago. To stick with the sports analogy, I don't want to get stagnant. I don't want to be considered an old school team. I don't want to be the Joe Paterno's Penn State team. Well, I don't want to be Joe Paterno's Penn State team for a few reasons, but that's one of them. If you are interested in signing up for that epoxy workshop, once a year we have a massive sale, and that sale is going on right now. And it's not just the workshop, it is site-wide. It is the Damascus marking knife, it's the epoxy workshop, it's the epoxy that I use. Even M3 Nano, which does not go on sale the rest of the year, is for sale right now. So there is a link in the video description, or you can scan that QR code now. The epoxy that I'm going to be using for the main pour is going to be transparent. And yes, that means for once in my life, I'm actually not doing a black epoxy table. But the number one nemesis of a transparent epoxy table is the little micro bubbles that get frozen in time and are forever encapsulated in your table. And I think most people think the only cause of micro bubbles comes from when you're mixing it. When you put that paddle mixer in there, you stir it up, and those little bubbles get frozen in time as the epoxy is curing. I would say the biggest cause of these micro bubbles actually comes from the wood itself, meaning there's little bits of air that's trapped in that wood grain, and even if your epoxy is 100% bubble free, as it cures, little bits of air are going to get released from that wood and give you a ton of micro bubbles. So this is how you prevent it. You just seal your edges really, really well. This is penetrating epoxy, and it does a good job of just that, penetrating. The only problem is if you mix up a little bit too much, it cures really quickly and rather violently, as demonstrated here. And I actually knew that I'd mixed up too much at this point, so I set it on the ground with a time lapse just so you guys could see exactly what happened. So make sure this isn't resting on the edge of your table when you do it. Most of you probably don't know this, but Scott, my video guy, is not just a normal video guy. He is an Emmy-winning Eagle Scout. He didn't win an Emmy for being an Eagle Scout. He won an Emmy, and he was also an Eagle Scout. Anyway, he was not impressed with my knot tying skills, so he tied one for me. All right, so your bow line thing is going to end up with a perfect 73-inch circle.
Taut line.
My taut line.
Yeah.
Taut line fancy thing.
It should.
What if it binds up in there?
It shouldn't. That's why we tied it like this, so it can turn around everything.
All right, pressure's on. Flowing very nicely. Oh no, we're still good. I would have went with a slip line.
It's how you're holding the marker.
I think it's shoddy knotmanship. All right, how accurate can I be?
Perfectly accurate.
As accurate as your circle?
Yes, in my perfect circle.
All right, maybe the problem was with how I was holding the pen and not Scott's knot, but here's another good example of why the big round table is the most difficult / most expensive table you can order, because straight lines are easy. You run it through your table saw, use a track saw. Curved lines are hard, and yeah, this only maybe added another 40 minutes to the project, but that 40 minutes adds up, an hour here, an hour there. the big round table is just a lot more time consuming.
Right at 73. Right at 73. Oh, these do perfect.
If you're going to use an aerosol mold release spray like I'm using here, make sure to cover up any wood that's in the vicinity because this stuff is so airborne it settles everywhere and it does a really good job at preventing epoxy to bonding to anything. So you don't want this landing on the wood that's then going to get epoxy on it. I've heard of other people using different things like paste wax, and I've tried a number of different mold releases. Some of them work, some don't. This one works really well. I just hate how airborne it is. Also makes the floor really slippery. So if you have a better suggestion, I'd love to hear, but for now, I'm just going to keep using that one. Most of the cool ideas you see in my videos are not original thoughts that I came up with. I mentioned earlier about sealing the wood to prevent bubbles. That is just a standard boat building practice. I've made these pretty unique tables out of denim and epoxy, and while I've never seen a table made that way before, I've seen knife handles made the exact same way for decades. I curved a piece of epoxy using heat. That same practice is used to make curved aquarium glass. So almost all the ideas you see in my videos are just a repurposed variation of something I've seen elsewhere. Except for this. This is my one contribution to the epoxy table world that is something I actually came up with, and that is using this synthetic landscape border to make a round epoxy table. And this is something I used to be really proud of because pretty much everybody has adopted this method for making these round tables. This time it doesn't quite work out as nicely as it usually does. This next step is another non-negotiable for me. If you're going to build an epoxy table, you have to do this. I've already sealed the underside of the slab the exact same way using this high-performance epoxy, and that'll prevent any air bubbles and also prevent any staining. The reason I'm doing it on the top as well is, one, it will prevent staining, and that's a big reason, even though the epoxy I'm using on this pour isn't going to be heavily tinted. The main reason, though, why you want to seal the top of your slab is you want to make sure that it's not bare wood exposed to the atmosphere, because the bottom part of your slab is going to be sealed airtight. And so that top part, if it's unsealed, it's going to be either taking in moisture from the atmosphere or releasing moisture from the slab to the atmosphere, which basically just means your table's going to start warping and twisting as it's curing. So if you seal the top, you will avoid that problem altogether. If you decide to seal your live edge like I did here, another step that you have to do, you can't skip this, is you really need to scuff them up. And the only reason you do this is just to ensure good adhesion between the main epoxy pour and your live edge. And I know it looks like it's kind of making it frosted or opaque here, but once the epoxy goes on, it will completely disappear. All of the epoxy prep was done, and now I just had to drop it in the mold and pour some epoxy. Once we got it over the edge, I realized that it didn't quite fit, and this didn't initially make any sense because I know this form was exactly 73 inches, and I thought that I'd measured the slab the same, but it was like 5 inches over. It wasn't even close to fitting, and it was fairly frustrating. I thought maybe we had a weird angle on it, and it wasn't anywhere close to fitting, and finally I realized that's okay. We'll just take it out, nip off a little bit of one edge, and then drop it right in.
Than normal.
I wish I had an answer for why that slab wouldn't fit in the form. It was like trying to solve one of those metal ring horseshoe puzzles where you know the ring comes off, you just can't get your brain to work in that dimension, and so eventually I just cut the ring off, so to speak. I was a little concerned that we might have damaged the form and opened us up for the possibility for a leak during that last debacle, so what I'm doing here is I'm pouring a really thin layer of fast-drying epoxy to seal up any leaks before they happen, hopefully.
Good news.
What?
We have a leak.
Well, that's not good news.
It is when we're doing this to prevent leaks.
Okay.
Better than 20 gallons of epoxy leak. Yeah. So this should cure pretty quick. Fill the leak.
Okay.
I've got a new tool that's pretty freaking cool, and I've never showed it in a video before, and it's not this 20-year-old cheap level, it's my workbench itself. when I had it fabricated, I had these leg levelers added onto it, and they work just as you would think they would work, and it's freaking awesome because no matter where in my shop, I can get it perfectly level since I have 4 of these leg levelers, and this will save me a ton of epoxy and also time on the CNC, because if I do a pour that's off by 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch, that means another 1/4 inch that they have to CNC off, and so this will save me a ton of time and a little bit of money. The epoxy color that I'm going for on this table is going to be something completely different than anything I've done on such a large project before. I've done small samples like this, but never a big project, and this is white epoxy dye, and I'm not going for a pure white table. I'm going for just a little bit of a frosted effect. I found that 4 drops per 3 gallons was just the right amount, and I'm using this little dropper just to make sure I get the exact right amount since I have multiple buckets, and it's going to be a cool look. And some of you might be worried about the yellowing, and you should be worried because all epoxy can yellow, but I added just 1 drop of blue per bucket, and it's not really going to be enough to make it look blue. As you can see there, it still looks fairly white, but it's going to really offset any potential yellowing down the line. Also, epoxies now are much better than they used to be. The UV inhibitors they have now are really, really good. I have this sample from Total Boat that I just set in my window quite a while ago, and it still looks perfectly clear. So it will, 20 years from now, probably show some yellow, but I don't think it's going to be really noticeable for a very long time. I poured the epoxy back and forth just to ensure that the color was identical between buckets, because even though I counted my drops and everything should be really close, if I just dumped these buckets independently into the table, there's a pretty good chance you'd see a really slight gradient of color because they wouldn't be completely identical in the end. And this is where, if you've done all your prep and you've taken your time, you shouldn't have any concerns here. Generally, I'm a little bit worried about leaks, but since I did that initial pour of the faster curing epoxy, I really wasn't even worried about leaks here. This is another really good tip to remove bubbles. If you think about putting a straw into a glass of Sprite, the bubbles like to cling to it, but if you're able to brush those bubbles off, they don't come back, and that's kind of the same here. There's just a little bit of surface tension where the bubbles like to cling to those sides.
It's pretty good. What do you think?
I think it's freaking awesome. Which part do you mean?
I guess all of it.
I was worried about the color. I think the color is perfect. We still have to see if this is too much depth. But we got fans, and it's cool. But I think this redwood, like that splash there, is gonna be probably, I can't think of another epoxy table that will even be nearly as cool as this one. I don't think it's gonna sell very well. Everybody can put a black epoxy and walnut table, especially a square one, rectangle one. Not everybody can fit a 6-foot redwood round table with icy whitish epoxy. But it doesn't mean it shouldn't get made. Unless you're a business, then it's probably a good reason not to make it. Okay, I'll regroup in 3 days.
All right.
I mentioned earlier how proud I was of myself that I came up with the idea of using this cheap landscape border as an effective way to make a round epoxy table, because normally when I take it off, it comes off like this, or like this, or like this. This time it came off like this, and like this. And I have no idea what changed on this project versus previous projects, but what I do know is I am slightly less impressed with my idea now. I wasn't sure if this border was ever going to come off, but if it did, I was going to need to find a new way to transport this back to CNC because I can no longer fit this in my truck. And I thought about it and I thought, you know what, I should just buy my own trailer. And the trailer that I would need would be like $8,000 to $10,000. And finally I thought about it some more and I was like, I could just rent a trailer for probably that same amount that it'll cost me to store every month. And then I thought about it more. I'm like, I could rent an enclosed trailer so I don't need to worry about rain or anything like that. And then I thought about it even more, and I can rent a whole freaking moving truck for less than I can rent a trailer. It was going to cost me $100 to rent an enclosed trailer for a day, and the entire rental cost for the U-Haul was, I think, $58 plus $13 that I paid in gas. So not too bad. And this is not a sponsored post. If you want a quick rant against U-Haul, is they gave it to me with basically no gas, and then it was my job to return it with the exact same amount, which is why I spent exactly $13. There are a lot of things that can go wrong when you CNC a wood and epoxy table. Normally I don't use the CNC at all. Normally I go up to that industrial shop, and there I'm in complete control. I can say, hey, let's make an aggressive pass, let's do a medium pass, let's do a really light pass. Here I'm basically completely out of control. I have to completely trust Nick, and I've never had him CNC a table for me before because I've never built one this wide. And the good thing is, I know he's built a ton of epoxy tables. He might have built more epoxy tables than I have, so I know he knows what he's doing. And I told him, I said, hey, you're hourly. Feel free to absolutely gouge me on the hourly if it means a better finished product. If you're wondering what kind of things can go wrong, years ago I was having a company flatten a table for me, and their bit worked loose and just augured a big hole into my table, and they just said sorry and then charged me the full amount anyway. Also, the table itself could get loose if it wasn't clamped down tightly and then just kind of blow up a little section of it. If you go too fast, it'll lead to major tear out, and that's my biggest fear, is if you feed this through too quickly, it'll just rip chunks of the wood and epoxy out, and then I can't really just sand it out because they can be, an 1/8 of an inch deep, and then your table basically won't be flat. So going really slow, knowing how to work the grain, and this was one of my favorite parts. He actually has a sander attachment for his CNC, and I think this is really cool. And also I keep calling it a CNC, and I know he's working it by hand, so call it whatever you want, flattening machine, but the sander attachment was really, really nice. After they finished with the top, they flipped the slab over and did the same process on the underside. And if you want to know what that process looks like, you can rewind the video about a minute and watch that again because it looks just like that. Anyway, we are back in my shop and ready for some actual woodwork now. I mentioned earlier that from a woodworking business perspective, building this giant round redwood epoxy table on spec, meaning not having a customer for it, probably not a very good business move. And you know what? I'm pretty comfortable with that because I'd like to think that from a woodworking YouTuber perspective, I should be okay. I'm really happy with how the build's shaping up. I think that's gonna be pretty cool in the end, and hopefully I'll end up getting some views on it. And if it doesn't sell, that's okay, but it doesn't mean that I don't want to sell it. And it also probably doesn't mean that I would be incapable of selling it for something. I could probably put this for sale for, $3,000 or $4,000, which is still a lot of money, and it might actually sell fairly quickly. However, just the slab alone retailed at over $7,000, and so I don't really feel like I'm doing my business a service by discounting something that much. And I don't love the rule of thirds when it comes to pricing your work, where some people say you should just take the total cost of all your materials and expenses, multiply that by 3, and that gives you your product cost. However, if I did that math on this table, I'd be around $25,000 to $27,000, which is pretty close to that quote that I'd given the guy for the walnut table. But one thing I've learned about dealing with rich people is they don't like to buy off the rack, meaning they want to control every aspect of the build, and I don't blame them. They want to pick the slab out, they want to pick the epoxy color, they want to pick the table base, and I think they should if you're spending that much money. And that's really how I've kind of based my business model in the past, is if you want something really nice and really custom, I'm your guy. You can have it any way you want it. And so I don't think I'm going to be able to get that custom price for this table, which is basically off the rack. Cutting a perfect circle without a CNC isn't particularly difficult, it's just a little time consuming and a little bit messy. After I had that initial cut with the circle cutting jig, now all I have to do is keep this held tight against the edge, and the only way I can mess this up is if I just loosen my grip. Okay, I messed this up the only way I was able to mess this up, but I have no choice now but to continue the cut and then check to see just how bad the mistake was. Well, it's not great, and it's basically in the worst possible spot. If it had been on the wood, I could have patched the wood so you'd never be able to see it, but my only option now is making the whole table a little bit smaller, and you can see I'm bringing it in right about 1/8 of an inch, which means the entire table is going to be about 1/4 inch smaller. And you know what? This is the one advantage to building something on spec, because if this was for a customer, I'm kind of on the hook for building a table the size they order. And now no one will know that this is actually a 71 3/4 inch table, just like I designed. I mentioned earlier that it was actually Scott, the video guy's idea on doing a big round table versus doing a rectangle table, but what I haven't mentioned is I basically given him total design freedom on this. He chose the epoxy color. I was going to do something different. He chose the islands that we put in there. He chose that edge profile bit. He chose all of the variables on this build, so he really gets all the credit if it does well, or the blame. I'm fine with either, but it's all Scott's. If you're watching this video and you start thinking to yourself that this redwood is pretty cool and you might want to replace your old boring oak dining table with a flashy redwood table, I have to give you kind of a fair warning if you decide to go down that route, because that is basically the equivalent to leaving your wife for an OnlyFans model. Sounds awesome at first, but it's gonna come with some baggage. And I'm not saying that you can't do it or shouldn't do it, I'll just present you with the pros and cons of both. And sticking with the pros is she's gonna look amazing. And I mean the redwood, of course. Your male friends will be jealous. Nobody else will have one, which I feel like could also maybe be a con. Moving on to the other cons. She's gonna be much more fragile than you're used to. She's gonna be much more expensive, at least for the really pretty ones, and likely will not last as long as more boring alternatives. And this is how I'm gonna get around some of those cons with this redwood table here. Is I spent about 2 days just infusing this thing with marine epoxy. I just rolled it on, squeegeed it on until it would not absorb any more epoxy. And this is gonna really harden it up, make it much less fragile, hopefully make it easier to sand, much less prone to denting. All of those cons should be mitigated with this epoxy. To stick with our analogy, it's kind of like a prenup. It provides some protection, but the cons are still under there somewhere. Because I didn't want a thick plastic layer on top of this table, once the wood reached saturation, I just troweled off all that excess epoxy, and this will not make redwood as strong as oak or even walnut, but it will be much more durable, much stronger than had I skipped this step altogether. There were a few dozen little pits and cracks that I filled after doing that epoxy infusion session that needed to be flattened out, and this is one of my most invaluable tools when it comes to finishing an epoxy table, because if I were just to put a sander right on this little epoxy lump, it would almost certainly eat into that wood before flattening out the bump and give you a really wavy surface, where this keeps everything nice and flat. And I thought that this epoxy was cured enough to start sanding on it, but after I got going, it was kind of rolling it up into little balls. I could feel it wasn't fully cured yet, so I was gonna give it a little bit longer. And in the meantime, I can show you a question that I get all the time, and that is, how do you clean your epoxy buckets and all your epoxy gear?
Do they all come out that cleanly?
Nope. After my unintentional Phil Collins solo, I got back to work on the sanding, and this table I was going about a little differently than I normally do. I was using a fairly high grit on my Rotex, 240 grit on the Rotex, and I normally only use the really low grits with this sander, and kind of hard to explain why I thought this was better, but what I'm trying to avoid is this redwood, especially redwood that's not been sealed with epoxy, is really variable in density, meaning the ridges of the grain are much harder than the valleys, and even a flat sander will find a way to kind of hunt into that valley, and what you'll get is a really wavy finish. So my main goal with this whole tabletop, with all this sanding, all this epoxy, everything I've done to it, is trying to keep it flat, and the best possible way to keep it flat is this. This is a block sander, and that's what I used before I applied the epoxy. This is a new one I got though. This one actually has a vacuum attachment, which I've never used, so I don't actually know if this is gonna work, but I'm gonna give it a shot right here. I wasn't sure how well this block sander was gonna work. One, I didn't know if the dust collection was a gimmick, and two, because it's made of foam, I thought it might be kind of soft and defeat the purpose of having a block sander, but it was actually really, really firm. The dust collection worked pretty well. It didn't attach to my vacuum very well though, so I'm gonna have to find some way to modify that in the future. Also, block sanders just don't give you as fine of a sanding pattern as an orbital, so I had to sand deep into the night until I finally got it good enough, and now I'm doing one final check, wiping it down with alcohol, making sure that my sanding pattern is really good, because what you don't want is to find some deep scratches at the last second when you're applying your finish, and everything looked pretty good. And this is one of those steps that I almost hate to do, because you almost always find something, but it is worth it, and it's much better to find it at this stage versus finding it after you have it finished. There's a lot about wood grain that I still don't understand and still have to learn, but it's fascinating stuff. You know, what causes various types of figuring and color and different grain patterns in wood. And this redwood is probably the most unique one I've ever worked with. And I was talking to Charlie, the guy that works on my trees for me, and he was telling me that this old growth redwood is really unique because all that weight of that massive tree is compressing on the bottom of the tree. So this was near the base, and over hundreds or even 1,000 years, it's getting squished down and causes this really crazy unique pattern. It's kind of like if somebody from My 600-Pound Life was wearing the same pair of high heels for a decade. At the end of that decade, first off, they're now going to be a pair of loafers, but the cross section, if you were able to slab out those high heels or now loafers, it's going to have this crazy squished out grain pattern that's probably going to look pretty cool, kind of like this redwood here. The finish that I'm going to be using here is a hard wax oil. It's going to finish and look really similar to Rubio Monaco if you want to get a comparable finish in your shop. The big difference with this one is it cures instantly under a UV light. It's a really cool technology. I don't necessarily recommend it for everybody because those lights are just so freaking expensive. This, however, I do recommend for everybody. This is N3 Nano. This is a nano finish that I offer for sale personally, and you can see just how much it bumps up the contrast in the sheen, and I ended up adding several coats of this, but if you want to see what it looks like as a side-by-side, I made this sample piece that I finished the exact same way just so you can see how impactful the N3 Nano is. And remember, this is the only sale of the year for N3 Nano. We also have that site-wide sale going on everything else right now. If you want some more information on that, you can check out the QR or the link in the video description. So this is how the very experimental giant round epoxy table ended up, but I have a bit of a twist to this story because normally at this point in the video, I would say something to the effect of, this piece is for sale if you want to check it out on my website, yada, yada, yada. As I was getting close to finishing this, I reached back out to GL Veneer, the company that gave me this slab to begin with, and said, do you guys want to buy this? And they said, maybe. And they talked it over and they said, we actually don't need any more tables. Can this be a wall piece? And I said, I actually haven't built the base for it yet, and I'd be happy to build you a wall mount. I did cut them a bit of a deal since they gave me the slab after all, but if you want to check this out, this will be at the GL Veneer headquarters in Southern California, and as always, thank you guys so much for making it all the way to the end of the video. Have a great week. Don't worry about why I had to latch it.
Please don't traffic me.